Chapter 16. Focus. In the years I spent documenting sexual abuse cover-ups at abortion facilities, I had come across a troubling pattern. Victims of sexual abuse were sometimes also victims of human trafficking. Government agencies estimated that there were hundreds of thousands of sex-trafficked children. I knew that these victims often became pregnant. I wanted to know what happened to these girls when they did. As much as I was willing to go undercover myself, I was becoming recognizable, regardless of my hair color, which made it imperative that I change my role from player to coach. For months, I worked to recruit and train a new team of investigative reporters for this new project. In 2011, Live Action initiated another multi-state trip to investigate the willingness of Planned Parenthood facilities to aid and abet sex traffickers of young girls. I had focused most of my research on Planned Parenthood because it was the largest abortion chain in the nation, committing at the time 1/4 of all abortions, and now more than a third. Following a carefully planned itinerary, our small group headed to New Jersey. The Garden State in January is no joke. We pulled our Jeep to the side of the road, and I opened the passenger door to hop out. As I tried to push the door open, it jammed against a pile of icy snow, preventing me from opening it all the way. We were in a hurry, and so I had to squeeze out as best I could. The crunch of the heavily packed snow beneath my boots reminded me of how much I miss California. I traded seats with Raoul in the back seat to help Giovanna get her camera placed. "How are you feeling, G?" I asked. "Good. I feel good," she said. She and Raoul were total champs. They were preparing to go undercover into a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic down the street. We were going to run a scenario in which Raoul played a pimp and Giovanna played his assistant. In the scenario, they were running an illicit sex ring of 14 and 15-year-old girls. They had been prepping for weeks and had already gone to other abortion clinics in the days prior. I waited in the car impatiently with David Delayden, already a live-action veteran of several years, and watched the snow fall softly on the pavement around us. Across the street from the abortion clinic was a cemetery. The small tombstones jutted up against a growing blanket of ice and snow. In the back section of the abortion clinic, smoke rose from the building. We wondered aloud what it could be. "Probably a crematorium," David said grimly. We had done our research. We knew cremation was one of the ways abortion clinics disposed of the bodies of their victims. The children killed here by an abortionist were placed into an oven to be incinerated, their little, small bodies turning into smoke, like the smoke we saw rising into the cold sky. There was no one to mourn them, to bury them, to remember them, to visit their graves. The minutes passed as we sat in silence, feeling the weight of the horror and tragedy across the street. Suddenly, there was a tap on the window. It was Raoul. His face looked pained and tense. He and Giovanna were back, early, from the clinic. We unlocked the door, and they both jumped into the back seat. "What happened?" I asked anxiously as David pulled out into the street. "How did it go?" "It was so busy in there," Giovanna said quietly. "So many women, all sitting there. Some of them looked really pregnant, like really pregnant. The staff were too busy to see us." As we drove away, we exchanged helpless looks. Every single baby was scheduled to die that day in that facility. We hadn't saved anyone. Each little boy and girl in that room was facing death alone with no one to advocate for them. I felt the familiar sting of helplessness. It was much the same sting I felt the first time I stood outside an abortion clinic to pray, and the first time I went into a clinic undercover. I contemplated again how women were being told abortion was empowering them, for them, and that millions continued to accept the false choice of abortion. My mind struggled to process the weight of the bloodshed and suffering. I was leading my team. We had a job to do, and there wasn't much time to process the human destruction we were witnessing. As I had done on other investigative trips, I allowed myself to ignore the painful emotions welling up deep in my heart, until I had a chance later, when our work was done for the day, to let myself weep. When we arrived at the next clinic in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, Raoul and Giovanni headed in. The conversation they recorded with the manager of that clinic was shock, even pro-abortion advocates. My two teammates explained that they managed a sex ring for underage girls in the country and needed access to cheap, confidential birth control and abortions. The Planned Parenthood office manager, Amy Woodruff, proved eager to help them. Woodruff told them not to report the girls' ages, as that triggered reporting requirements. For the most part, we want as little information as possible, Woodruff said. When asked if the girls could obtain abortions, Woodruff recommended that the pimp and his associate go to another clinic whose protocols are not as strict as ours. When Woodruff helpfully explained that the girls could not have intercourse for a minimum of 2 weeks after having an abortion, Raoul rose to the moment. In the role of a disgruntled pimp, he asked how the girls would be able to make money during those off weeks. Woodruff didn't hesitate. She recommended that Raoul use the girls' bodies waist up. She spoke as matter-of-factly as if she were telling him how to arrange the merchandise in a display window. Marketing advice. Her attitudes and words were devoid of any empathy or conscience. Watching the video of the day's investigation in the hotel room that night, I felt a sense of numbness. It was hard to process how truly banal the evil was. How normal and carelessly Woodruff talked. She behaved like this was normal behavior for her, a normal treatment for the girls and women who walked through her door. The cruel dehumanization of children not yet born was also extended to their mothers. Woodruff was hardly unique. In Richmond, Virginia, a Planned Parenthood staffer told our investigator, posing as a sex trafficker, how to get around parental consent laws to obtain abortions for the trafficked minor girls. In Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, a staffer counseled the trafficker on how to get the girls tested for STIs, how to work the system without health insurance, and how best to secure the girls an abortion. In Roanoke, Virginia, a staffer told our trafficker, from the age of 12 up, for birth control, you can just come in and do that. You don't have to have a parent, okay? In the Bronx, when a trafficker explained that the girls he managed were as young as 14, the staffer reassured him, we see people as young as 13. Everything is totally confidential. Everywhere our team went that winter, the pattern was the same. Turning a blind eye to the sex trafficking of underage immigrant girls, Planned Parenthood staffers promoted abortion with the fervor of used car salesmen from hell. As we edited the videos and designed a release strategy, we firmed up our plans to go to more Planned Parenthood clinics to get even more footage. However, the plan wasn't to be. In January 2011, the day before the annual March for Life in Washington, I got a phone call from the Reuters reporter. I thought he was going to ask me about the March for Life, but instead, the reporter asked me flat out, is it true that people from your group are posing as sex traffickers? I took a deep breath, my mind racing. How did he know to ask that? Someone at Planned Parenthood must have figured out our strategy and tipped him off. And the footage will speak for itself. I responded as calmly as I could. My mind was racing. Planned Parenthood was trying to spike our story by giving it to the press before we did. I knew we had to break the story before Planned Parenthood had a chance to control the narrative with its own preemptive report. I called the investigations to a halt. Planned Parenthood would obviously put its employees on alert. They might even comply with the law for a few weeks, or at least pretend to. This left us no choice but to start releasing the video we had shot. I was already in Washington, D.C. for the March for Life and decided to stay in town for another week. This was an opportunity to try to defund Planned Parenthood of the hundreds of millions of dollars a year they received in taxpayer funds. My only other staffer at the time, Danny, agreed to spend the week with me. We were living out of a hotel while I did media interviews and met with members of Congress and other heads of pro-life groups. It was a crazy time. The battle to keep my eyes fixed on the goal was highlighted in one interview I did during that time. I had been up the whole night before editing our next video for release, and I spent the morning, beginning at 6 o'clock, doing back-to-back media appearances and meetings. In the afternoon, I hopped in a taxi and headed bleary-eyed to CNN's Washington studio for a remote interview with one of its on-air hosts, Brookie Baldwin. After arriving, I sat in the makeup chair trying to concentrate on what I would say in the interview. As I looked in the mirror, I thought, CNN makeup is no Fox News makeup. It didn't matter. No amount of makeup could cover the dark circles under my eyes. Lila Rose? A camera technician leaned his head into the green room. "You're on." I followed him down the hallway and into a small studio, where he mic'd me for the remote. I breathed a prayer, hoping I wouldn't fall asleep in the chair or say something incoherent. Through my earpiece, I heard a voice say, "Program starting in 15 seconds. The program opened, and Brookie began asking a series of tough questions. The one that I would remember was this. Do you, Lila, have this myopic agenda to take down this federally funded group, and do you think you'll be successful? First of all, Brookie, you can read our mission, I responded. We state it clearly on our website. Our goal is to expose the abuse, cover-up, the corruption, the illicit activity going on every day in abortion clinics. Once the interview was over, I had to laugh. Our narrative was powerful enough and our evidence strong enough that it seemed to deprive the reporter of reasonable objection. Would she have asked those same hostile questions to an environmental activist, a gun control activist, or even a pro-abortion activist? I doubt it. If Brookie knew that there were centers in her city legally killing 1-year-olds, would she use the word myopic to describe efforts to stop the killing? I hope not. In a similar vein, if Brookie knew that a corporation was willing to help sex traffickers succeed in their business, would she call the efforts of those trying to stop the traffickers myopic? Of course not. What made our efforts myopic, in her view, was our target. Intentionally or not, Brookie had confused myopia with focus. Myopia, as Brookie used it, is a narrow view or a lack of discernment. Focus, however, is intentional concentration and effort. Of course, I was focused and determined. Without focus, I would not be sitting in a CNN studio talking to Brookie Baldwin. Without focus, I would be back in California, hanging out with my peers, wondering how the surf was running at Santa Cruz, not wrestling to replace CNN's false narrative with the truth. If anyone was myopic, it was most media groups, not us. Virtually all major newspaper editorial boards support abortion. Most major media groups support abortion. Their myopic support for abortion has devastating effects on their reporting. For example, for 16 years, Pennsylvania health authorities and the Pennsylvania media had turned a blind eye to the practice of an abortionist named Kermit Gosnell. In fact, had law enforcement not searched his premises and a prescription opioid void, Gosnell might never have been brought to justice. Most of what Gosnell did every day was legal. He killed children up through 9 months of pregnancy, operating in squalid conditions on mostly low-income and minority women. Some of the women died due to the unsanitary conditions and his unsafe procedures. In the case of failed abortions, and there were several, he simply cut the spines of babies, alive, outside the womb, and killed them. In May 2013, Gosnell was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter in the death of a patient. The media paid little attention to the case, and when they were finally embarrassed into covering Gosnell's trial, a blogger posted a picture of an empty press section in the courtroom that went viral. They accepted the spin of activists such as Elise Hogue, president of NARA All Pro-Choice America. Justice was served to Kermit Gosnell today, and he will pay the price for the atrocities he committed. Hogue told the New York Times, confident the reporter would parrot her talking point. Anti-choice politicians and their unrelenting efforts to deny women access to safe and legal abortion care will only drive more women to back-alley butchers like Kermit Gosnell. It didn't matter that this wasn't the back alley. Most of the atrocities Gosnell had committed were perfectly legal. Despite the bias of most media groups, our sex trafficking videos were shocking enough and were viewed enough through social media that even the New York Times felt compelled to respond. Staying on message, Stuart Scheer, Vice President for Communications of Planned Parenthood, told the Times that Planned Parenthood had zero tolerance for unethical behavior and that the behavior filmed at the Perth Amboy Clinic was very isolated. Planned Parenthood also called me an anti-choice extremist who was trying to discredit the organization through selectively edited footage, fully ignoring the fact that we released the unedited footage to any media group that requested it. Having seen firsthand numerous instances of unethical behavior by Scheer's colleagues over the previous 4 years, I could have assured him there was nothing isolated about this incident. In an effort to prove its lies, Planned Parenthood made Woodruff, the Perth Amboy manager, the scapegoat, and fired her. She made the mistake of getting caught. But our evidence was stronger than their denials. The videos forced their way to network coverage. For a week, almost every primetime cable and network news show covered the investigations with, of course, an inevitable spin. ABC, for instance, interviewed me for 30 minutes, asking me the same questions over and over again, but included only Planned Parenthood's defense in their piece. The producers were content to stick an image of me being interviewed in the background. A week after the first video's release, we knew we needed more time on the ground in Washington, D.C. I negotiated with the hotel manager for a larger room at a fixed rate for the next 2 weeks. Thankfully, the beautiful and historic St. Matthew's Cathedral was 2 blocks down the street, and I was able to stop there every day to attend Mass and pray in the middle of the storm. With Father Paul's and Tessa's encouragement, I made that prayer my daily priority. It was prayer that helped me focus, and remembering that God, who was all-powerful and all-loving, would win the ultimate war for justice. The forces that can shake our focus are usually not the ones typical to the battle. During those weeks, I faced attacks from the abortion industry and their supporters, personal negative news reports, online trolls mocking me, and even multiple death and rape threats. There was even a fake site that imposed my face on pornographic images. But these attacks were to be expected, and they showed me that I was over the target. Instead of derailing my focus, all these things reminded me this was a life-and-death battle, and there was a cost. What troubled me more than death threats was hearing some leaders of like-minded organizations say behind closed doors that they couldn't support our efforts because the time wasn't right yet. Leaders who didn't seem to think that defunding the abortion industry was even possible, at least not for years or even decades. These should have been our allies. Instead, they were becoming obstacles. They had other agendas, and defending Planned Parenthood wasn't one of them. It seemed to me that for some of them, the time would never be right. What threatened my focus the most during those weeks had nothing to do with our investigation, or the attacks or obstacles we faced. It had to do with an ex-boyfriend. He had pursued me for years. We had become close friends, and then we started dating. Our relationship had begun to bring into focus some of my own wounds from childhood, which I hadn't yet come to understand and process. I also didn't have good boundaries or the experience needed to recognize unhealthy patterns in a relationship, and there were plenty of these patterns in ours. Despite the good advice of friends and family, I struggled to maintain boundaries with him once we broke up. We had just broken up a month before, and it didn't help that he lived in D.C. and showed up to the churches where I prayed or events I attended. Now he was leaving me letters at the front desk of the hotel, pleading to get back together. If I ever thought I was some sort of superwoman, that week sent me crashing back to earth. While all the activity of the media and political battle was demanding my attention and energy, the heartache I felt over my ex and the unexpressed grief over the childhood wounds that our relationship had unearthed felt destabilizing. Years later, I would learn to recognize the grief and grieve the impact of the specific challenges and hurts in my own childhood, the stress I had internalized from my mother and the struggles in my parents' marriage. But for now, it all felt like a swirling vortex deep beneath the surface that sometimes threatened to pull me under. One night, desperately needing a few hours of sleep before an early morning interview, I lay in bed crying. I didn't even have the words to express why I felt the pain I was feeling. I only knew to pray, God, help me. I need you. Although full clarity and healing didn't come that night, or even for years, God gave me the peace and strength to persevere. In those quiet, painful moments that no one sees, and we all have them, there's no one better to surrender to. Despite the internal struggles and the external chaos, those weeks of laser-like focus in Washington, D.C. were making a historic impact. Our video evidence was powerful enough to incite Congress to act in an unprecedented way. The House of Representatives voted for the first time in history to defund Planned Parenthood of their $500 billion a year in tax dollars. The vote was bipartisan. Several Democrats and independents joined Republicans. This was an extraordinary move, the first and only time it ever happened, and our myopic efforts had made it possible. Our next obstacle was the Senate, then controlled by Democrats. Surely, we thought, even rock-solid abortion defenders couldn't defend or ignore the abuses we documented. They'd at least investigate them. Politically, both sides would have no choice but to take action and stop the government funding. Or so I hoped. Unfortunately, pro-choice senators were not about to buck the abortion industry that helped fund their campaigns, and then-President Barack Obama gave no indication they ought to. He met regularly with the head of Planned Parenthood, with whom he had a close relationship, and that was all the signal the Senate needed. Looking back on this particular battle, I have to marvel, not at our ultimate failure to defund Planned Parenthood at the time, but at our ability to get so close. The vote by the House of Representatives proved that defunding Planned Parenthood was a viable political goal. It had never been done before. I was 22 at the time. My teammates were no older. We took on a billion-dollar corporation and its powerful allies and ignited momentum to bring them down. We did this because we stayed the course with our investigative work over a period of years. We had begun with exposing sexual abuse cover-up in Los Angeles clinics, then exposed that abuse cover-up nationally, and then expanded the investigation to the aiding and abetting of traffickers. If we had stopped our investigative work after our first few tries, we would never have made it this far. The reality is, we'll make little progress if we are constantly giving up on one project or strategy to start a new one. A good project, completed, has more value and impact than a dozen projects we never finished. We have to keep our focus. As you and I fight for our causes, both the opportunities and challenges we face can make it increasingly difficult to keep that focus. We may see hundreds of opportunities as well as reasons why we should try something and then reasons why we shouldn't. For every person cheering us on, there may be 100 critics, and the personal struggles we face may be even more daunting. Along the way, we may also be ridiculed for our focus. This is inevitable. Maybe we will face negative attention from peers, or even from the media. There will be a comment online, perhaps from a friend, that will feel like a knife in the back or a slap in the face. This is all part of the battle, and many who oppose us may treat us poorly. How do we keep our focus? Ultimately, we remember for whom and for what we are fighting. The principle that needs defending, the injustice that needs exposing, the vulnerable person who cries out for help. In the tough moments, we can lean on our mentors and friends, take time to rest and pray, and then return to the battle. There's no turning back or backing down. The more we focus and the more doggedly we strive for our goal, the less likely it is that we will be stunned by the darts that inevitably come from all sides.